Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And every now and then, a meme becomes so popular that the substance behind it becomes an afterthought. But when it comes to a meme like Magneto was right, there is real, genuine substance behind that sentiment. And it's the kind of sentiment that should not be an afterthought. Not in the pages of Marvel Comics where the saying first originated, and certainly not in the real world where its message still resonates. Now, if you followed X-Men comics in any capacity, or hell, even if you just watched the first X-Men movie, you're probably familiar with this saying. Magneto being right in the general sense of the word has been part of the X-Men mythos for decades. It became a formal meme in the early 2010s, but during the 3-part Tolerance is Extinction episode of X-Men 97, this idea gained far greater awareness, even among those who weren't familiar with X-Men lore. This wasn't just some offhand comment that Valerie Cooper said in a moment of painful realization. After the events of Episode 5, Remember It, and the complete destruction of Genosha, saying Magneto was right turned into this powerful, dramatic moment. It was a lone human admitting outright that this man's deep hatred for humanity, as well as the reasons he puts forth for feeling this way, it was totally 100% vindicated. It was powerful in that it gave form and substance to Magneto's motivations. It also made what he ultimately did in that same episode understandable. Yes, it was objectively horrific in that it threatened to doom the entire planet. But even by the end of the subsequent episodes, you can still see where he's coming from. It's a big part of what makes Magneto such a compelling character. It's also why Magneto blurs the lines between hero and villain more than most. In recent years, more and more people who follow the X-Men are reluctant to even call him a villain. X-Men 97 might have given greater weight to the notion that Magneto was right, but it's also worth taking a step back to scrutinize the substance behind that notion. Because it's not just a core component of what makes Magneto compelling. It has real-world implications that extend beyond any comic book, movie, or meme. Magneto has said for years, both in the comics and in other mediums, that humanity cannot and will not tolerate mutants. He knows this because humans always find an excuse to hate one another, especially those who are weak, vulnerable, and easily scapegoated. That's certainly not an overly radical observation. Even in the early days of the X-Men comics, anyone with a certain measure of awareness could find real-world examples. The civil rights movement was in full swing when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created the first issues of Uncanny X-Men. They themselves were impacted by these issues, being Jewish men who'd fought in World War II. But it really wasn't until writer Chris Claremont took over the X-Men comics that Magneto became a more complex character. Claremont was the one who developed Magneto's backstory, making him a victim of the Holocaust, having him live through one of the worst atrocities in human history. That really gave new context and depth to Magneto's actions, because prior to that, he'd been a fairly generic villain, existing only as an antagonist to Professor Charles Xavier and his X-Men. But this newly added depth really complicated that antagonism, because suddenly, the X-Men weren't fighting some madman seeking to destroy humanity out of pure malice. They were fighting someone with a legitimate gripe against humanity. This affected more than just the heroic battles and villainous subplots. It brought into question the idealism behind Professor Xavier's dream, as well as the entire purpose of the X-Men. They may think they know how bad it can get for mutants. They may even think they can grasp humanity's capacity for hatred and bigotry. But they just don't. They really can't because they never experienced anything like Magneto experienced during the Holocaust. So when he points out how humanity treats those they hate, fear, and fail to understand, it's impossible to say he's wrong in those sentiments. You can certainly argue with him over his methods and his recourse. You can also point out the egregious nature of his many actions. But you just can't get around the validity of his observations. This is why, by the 1980s, the X-Men comics struggled to maintain Magneto's villainous status. If there was a critical turning point during this era, it unfolded in the pages of Uncanny X-Men 200, aptly titled The Trial of Magneto. In addition to serving as inspiration for the plot of Episode 2 of X-Men 97, this issue had Magneto stand trial before an international court for his many crimes. But in the process of trying to prosecute him, all it ended up doing was further vindicating him. Because in order to frame Magneto as a monster on par with every other pure evil supervillain, it was necessary to ignore why he came to despise humanity with such fervor. The fact that this was the primary tactic of the prosecution, it came off as a tacit admission that they cannot argue the merits of Magneto's motivations. They had to focus on his actions without ever understanding what informed his actions. But Magneto does not let them separate his deeds from his goals. In one powerful moment within this comic, he says outright that his goal has always been to prevent mutant kind from suffering another Holocaust. Because of his lived experiences, he just cannot accept that there will never be another atrocity on that scale. He rightly points out that people kill each other over all sorts of arbitrary differences. So how is someone like him, a man who witnessed so much death and cruelty, supposed to believe that humanity has adequately learned from past injustices? And keep in mind, Magneto made this point in 1985. Back then, people in the real world were certainly aware of injustices. Humanity's capacity to hate, oppress, and slaughter did not end with the Holocaust. And no matter how horrified the general public was of such events, it did not stop other atrocities unfolding in the decades that followed. And people are more aware of these injustices than ever. The widespread availability of information has allowed everyday people to access knowledge of humanity's darkest moments. But that awareness has not always prevented subsequent atrocities. It often just fosters communities with contrasting worldviews, full of ordinary people who either prefer to ignore the horrors of past injustices or even make excuses for them. It's an uncomfortable, unnerving insight. Hearing it come from a character like Magneto, someone most often portrayed as a villain, it really doesn't sit well, and it really shouldn't. Him being right about humanity implies he's justified in pursuing violence. The only thing that really holds him back are the choices he makes and the close personal ties that he maintains. Later on in this same issue, Magneto's actions actually reflect this. He successfully stops an attack by the Von Strucker twins, who sought revenge on him and Charles Xavier for killing their father, who also happened to be a major in the German army. In the process, Xavier is wounded, and he gives Magneto a chance to make a different kind of choice, one that involves less violence. It's a chance that Magneto reluctantly takes. It's also a powerful moment that reveals another side to Magneto. As much as he does hate humanity, he is fiercely loyal to his friends and his fellow mutants. He will seek to do what's best for them, even if it means setting his hatred and his traumas aside. But, time and again, humanity proves incapable of subverting their capacity for hatred and bigotry. In later comics, as well as movies, cartoons, and games, more atrocities follow. Events like the Morlock Massacre, the destruction of Genosha, House of M, and Fall of X, they all involve horrific acts against mutants. More recently, Fall of X even had mutants being forced into internment camps or deported. At that point, Magneto isn't just right, it feels disturbingly prophetic. And the larger complexities of his character is really the only thing keeping him from waging a full-scale war against humanity. As fans of the comics and as functional human beings, we don't want to see that war, if only because we know that humans will not be on the right side of it. And therein lies the reason why Magneto being right matters, as both a story and as an overarching message. It reminds us, here in the real world, that we are not as evolved as we think we are. It's easy for us to read an X-Men comic or see a report of some horrific atrocity and think, yeah, that's awful, but we're better than that. But are we really? That is not an unreasonable question. We may answer it by simply pointing out that most people don't commit such terrible acts. Magneto is wrong for condemning the whole of humanity for the actions of a select few. On the surface, that's entirely reasonable, and it's easy for most non-bigoted people to accept. But dig a little deeper, dare to acknowledge the larger complexities and nuances, and it feels more like a convenient excuse rather than a legitimate reason. It's easy to condemn atrocities like the Holocaust, slavery, segregation, or ethnic cleansing when it happens in history books. But when these injustices keep happening in the present, and when ideologies similar to those that motivated these atrocities continue to find adherents, can you honestly say that we're that much better? How we answer that question depends a lot on our perspective. Someone from a poor, impoverished background isn't going to respond in the same way as someone who comes from a world of affluence and comfort. Magneto as a character represents someone whose perspective was informed by the worst possible circumstances. And over the course of his life, he's observed humanity as it emerged from the ashes of World War II. But what he sees is not all that promising. Time and again, both in the comics and in the real world, we, the human race, keep proving him right. And even when we collectively acknowledge that, too few people are inclined to demand better. Fittingly, that is one area where both Magneto and Charles Xavier often agree. Humanity as a whole needs to be better. We need to prove that we've evolved as a species and as a society. Charles Xavier believes that we still can. Magneto doubts that it's even possible. For now, outside the world of Marvel Comics, it's still worth belaboring. Magneto was and still is right. We, the human race, have done plenty to prove him right in the distant and not so distant past. But whether or not he's right in the long run, well, that's still up to us. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, take care and stay safe.